I'm going to go ahead and start tonight's meeting. I just want to wish everyone a good evening. And I'm going to be doing a presentation for this meeting. And when I share my screen, I won't be able to see who's participating. So we'll be going through the presentation, and then at the end, we'll take questions and comments about our project. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. I see that that is in place. So I will go ahead and start a discussion tonight about our Parking Reimagine project in Fairfax County. My name is Michael Davis, and the screen says Austin Gastrell. I'm hosting on his behalf tonight, but I am with the Department of Land Development Services in Fairfax County, and I am the parking program manager with that agency. We are teaming with the Department of Planning and Development on this project, and we have Bill Mayland of our project team in the meeting tonight participating. As indicated, we'll have a Q&A period after the presentation. If you have a question, you can electronically raise your hand to be called upon. And there's also a chat box in the meeting that you can send questions in through the chat. Parking has a profound influence in Fairfax County. With some exceptions, all land uses are required to provide parking. Driving remains a common activity, and developers and property users feel obligated to provide it, even in places where it's not required. However, we must weigh the value of parking against other desirable community elements, such as affordability, equity, the environment, site design, and economic viability. The need to provide more parking than necessary and meet confusing and restrictive regulations hinders the accomplishment of these goals. The current regulations encourage placing a higher importance on driving and parking than the possibility of using excess parking to increase housing options. Regulations create challenges for startup businesses looking for affordable space when needing to meet paper parking requirements. The lack of flexibility creates lost opportunities to adjust development to preserve or enhance community space. Our presentation tonight creates an outline for an enhanced approach to parking regulation in the county, one that looks at the context of development, as well as acknowledging that flexibility and predictability are important considerations for continuing our efforts for better, more compact land design, affordability, and economic growth. The primary goal of this project is right-sizing parking requirements. This concept involves sizing parking to the average demand for it. This approach applies to all areas of the county, from rural, suburban, to high-intensity urban development. Because of these differences in character, different minimum parking requirements should apply. In lower density areas, we propose conventional approaches to parking, but want to avoid burdensome requirements. In medium density areas, we're accommodating innovation, but allowing conventional approaches. In higher density areas, we're pushing for innovation and discouraging conventional approaches. Overall, the next wave of development investment should involve less parking. If we meet the goal of right-sizing parking requirements, then other important goals can be realized. Opportunities for better land stewardship occur, such as designing sites to exchange parking for community and green spaces. Less parking with better land design, access to multiple transportation modes, and a mix of uses dampens the need and desire for personal vehicle travel. From an administrative point of view, simplification and flexibility in our parking requirements is expected to create opportunities beneficial to the community. While we strive to right-size parking and requirements, we also know there are places and uses that present parking challenges. This project continues to evaluate options to address those issues. Parking Reimagine project is intended to examine and adjust parking requirements and processes to provide community benefits. In our effort to create places where people want to be, autos and parking must have less influence in design. The Cap One site in Tysons, the Mosaic District in Merrifield, and Reston Town Center are great examples where a walkable, compact, mixed-use urban design has taken precedence over street-oriented surface parking lots that create a vehicle gulf between the roadway and the place you want to be. These Main Street and urban rail and transit accessible places are as much a part of the county's fabric as low-density, tree-covered residential suburban development. Both places and the arc of development in between offer desirable characteristics for living, work, and entertainment. The county needs a balance to thrive, and this includes something as mundane as parking requirements. Our population is diverse. Some want to live in areas where personal travel in cars is unimportant relative to being surrounded by urbanity. Others want to live in a community where green spaciousness is worth a trade-off of driving to access even basic goods and services. This approach to parking seeks to acknowledge and respect these diverse perspectives. Further, we want to diminish obstacles to business opportunities. Meeting arcane parking requirements and rates designed for more car-centric activities of 30 to 40 years ago constrains new business ventures, reinforces poor land and environmental management activities, and creates opportunity costs for uses that will provide community benefit, such as more affordable housing. All of this helps the county succeed. With continued evaluation of a parking framework with our consultant, Nelson Nygaard, staff has created a proposed approach which is depicted here. With the intent of right-sizing parking, this is particularly important where the densities and intensities of development allow for greater innovation in approaches. Thus, this map shows a concentration of areas subject to lower parking requirements. At least 90% of the county's land area will remain subject to baseline requirements with some proposed modifications. Lower minimum parking requirements are focused on areas defined in the comprehensive plan as growth areas. In this framework, the following tiers are proposed. In suburban centers, we want to recognize that while development in these areas is of relatively lower density, the concentration of development within these areas provides opportunities for modest connectivity and shared activities that reduce parking demand. A 10% baseline reduction is proposed. Revitalization areas such as community business centers, commercial revitalization areas, and commercial revitalization districts are proposed for a baseline 20% reduction, which is consistent with today's standards. Transit station areas and the Tysons Urban Center are areas adjacent to transit-oriented development areas and are proposed to have a 30% baseline reduction. These areas are generally planned for higher density mixed-use development with good access to Metro Rail, as well as higher quality transit availability and a more walkable environment. Transit-oriented development areas are proposed to have a baseline 40% reduction in the minimum parking requirements. These are areas within 1/2 mile of a metro station. Since many of these areas are planned for development that complements Metro Rail, with higher density and intensity in compact urban designs, parking should be minimized to support the rail and transit investments and create a pedestrian-scaled community. For TOD, we are also proposing the property owners could adopt our planned Tysons Corner rates that include low or no minimum requirements and parking maximums through the rezoning entitlement process or a staff-administered process. Planned Transit Tysons, also referenced as PTC zoning, are sites within the Tysons Urban Center that have been rezoned to the PTC district or have opted into the PTC through a staff-administered process. The Tysons Urban Center is the county's downtown with the highest allowable densities. With acceptance of the PTC designation, property owners have low or no minimum parking requirements and maximum parking requirements. This project proposes to retain these criteria for the Tysons Urban District. The parking rates and area reductions under consideration with this project generally affect minimum requirements. Caps on parking, known as maximums, are only proposed with development that chooses to opt in to no minimum requirement. This option would only be available in the Tysons PTC and in transit-oriented development districts. I note also that we've been looking at the relationship of accessible parking to parking reduction efforts. Our intent is to base accessible parking on the baseline minimums that we are proposing, even in areas and circumstances where parking reductions can occur. On the screen now is a list of draft residential uses and proposed parking requirements for these uses. As you can see, there are a number of uses listed: multifamily dwelling, single-family attached dwelling, single-family detached with accessory living unit, stacked townhouses, group residential facility, live-work development, and manufactured home. As you can see, there are some changes that are proposed, and I'll kind of highlight some of the bigger changes that we're considering. For multifamily dwelling, we're looking at a potential rate of 1.3 spaces per unit, and that is based on a lot of analysis that we have done, including looking at data nationally as well as locally to see what average demand is for parking for these types of complexes. And with that, there are different characteristics locationally that are looked at as part of this analysis. And the baseline rate would be based on a typical suburban apartment complex, and the information that we have gotten from this research that indicates that an average demand rate is about 1.3 spaces per unit rather than the current 1.6. The other thing I wanted to highlight is for single family attached, which is a townhouse essentially. We have looked at this, this rate, and at this point we're proposing really no change to how the ultimate parking associated with the rate, but we've kind of tried to address some of the concerns that have been out there with regard to visitor parking within townhome communities and that sort of thing. And so we've kind of stratified this rate a little bit to say that we're looking at 2 spaces per unit for a single family attached dwelling. And then the 0.7 would be associated with providing this additional visitor or shared parking on the townhouse development site. These are some additional draft residential uses that we are looking at. And a lot of these relate to the simplification and condensation of rates that we have been considering in association with this project. You know, one of the key focus areas for parking rates in particular was trying to standardize things as much as possible and simplify the approach, because as we've said previously in previous discussions, one of the goals of this project is to provide a clearer approach for people who are trying to establish uses in the county, business persons and so forth. And the rates that we have for a number of uses are a bit arcane as far as how they can be determined, as well as a little indefinite as far as, you know, do you know how many people are going to be working for you at a given time? And do you know how many people are going to be occupying your space? So these are things that we're trying to move away from as best we can, try to work toward measures that are a little bit more tangible throughout the life of the project, from entitlement to site planning and permitting. So these rates that are shown here represent some consolidation and simplification associated with that approach. And then going through some base rates, as well as examining how the base rates would translate through the tiered approach that I had discussed earlier in the conversation. In this case, again, a single family attached dwelling, the current rate is 2.7 spaces per unit. And then the proposed rate, as I described a few moments ago, is 2 spaces per unit. But then the 0.7 would translate into providing visitor or shared parking on the site, which could result in actually a net increase in the amount of parking provided, because today the townhouse garage is counted as a parking space. And so it, you know, when that rate gets blended out, it to the 2.7, you know, it creates a parking supply, but then the 0.7 here can create an additional area of parking that is dedicated for visitors and shared uses. And then as I discussed a few moments ago, currently multifamily dwelling is 1.6 spaces per unit, and what we're proposing is 1.3 based on the research that we've done in association with multifamily. So the next sample rate that we want to talk about is a restaurant. And this is an example of working toward simplification in the rates, as well as a recognition of the nature of parking demand for restaurants. So as you can see, the current rate for a restaurant is divided into square footages of less than 5,000 and more than 5,000. And it also defines a parking space per 1,000 square feet of outside seating, and then further in excess of 20 outdoor seats. And then for greater than 5,000, it's in excess of 32 outdoor seats. So there's a rate differential here. There's a nuance of, you know, whether you have outside seating, and then even further, it talks about the number of seats. And so what we're proposing is a little bit lower rate that would apply universally to all restaurant types, either 5,000 square feet and below or above, and also just focusing on a square footage of the outdoor seating area rather than a second calculation based on the number of seats. And then retail sales is another one that has a little bit of a complicated rate, easy to figure out based on the square footage, but you know, you have to do a calculation for the first 1,000 square feet and then a calculation for the additional square footage above that. But the other thing that we were looking at with retail is that we have not looked at retail rates since, I believe, 1978. So given the amount of change that has been occurring with online sales, with retail pickup, or you can order online and pick up at the store, there have been significant changes in how people shop and where they shop. And this is reflected in demand for retail parking, which we've also analyzed both locally and nationally. And so the rate that we're showing here, the proposed rate of 4 spaces per square feet, is a little bit more rationalized to the actual parking demand for retail in Fairfax County. And with that, we wanted to transition into showing you how a retail parking rate would translate through the percentages that we are proposing. And as you can see here, the current rate and the proposed base rate as shown in the previous slide. And then you can see for a suburban center, a revitalization district, TSA and a TOD and PTC, what those requirements would be, the minimum requirements, I would emphasize, would be for these particular areas. So getting back to some a base rate, office, the current rate is stratified into 3 square footage divisions with a rate associated with each one of those. We are proposing to simplify that with a lower rate. Again, office, I do not believe has been analyzed since 1988 for the parking rate associated with it. But also the office demand has changed significantly over time as well. And that was occurring even prior to COVID. We were seeing trends where teleworking and other non-in-office activities were in decline. And in the county, we could visually see that office parking demand was not in line with the rate that was that is in existence today. So we've looked at this more closely. We've stratified it into two square footage thresholds, 50,000 square feet or less, and then greater than 50,000 square feet. And we have ranges under consideration associated with that are more in line with what we're seeing for office demand before the pandemic, and conceivably with changes that have occurred in how people are working since the pandemic. It was a little unclear if that was going to continue, or if that will continue, I should say. So we're looking at the trends that were occurring prior to the pandemic with this parking exercise. And potentially in the future, we could look at this again if the trends that are, if the circumstances that are occurring today continue to be a trend associated with more working at home and other factors that are lowering office demand for parking and people being in the office. And again, this is another example of the tiered approach and how office would apply to that. In this case, an office that is upwards of 125,000 square feet. Most offices in an office mixed use development are about that size, 125,000 square feet. And so you can see here the minimum requirement for an office in these stratified areas. You know, again, the higher percentages reflecting an office, an environment where we have more mixed use developments and more opportunities to reduce parking based on the factors that I had discussed earlier. And one more, warehouse. This is one when I was discussing earlier about the complexities of the parking rates. This is an example where you have a number of spaces per employees, a number of spaces per company vehicles, spaces to accommodate the largest number of visitors, which, you know, is a very unknown quantity. But then with all of that, you'd still have a minimum of 1 space per 1,000 feet of gross floor area. So our simplification just bases this rate on 1,000 spaces per, or 1 space per 1,000 square feet, which is the default rate in the current rate. We're also considering other language in the ordinance that would address, for example, company vehicles, you know, that they would still need to be accommodated, but not really specifying a rate or a number for that. So with that, we have the project timeline here on the screen. We started in October of last year, and we've been having you know, a period where we've been doing research, having conversations with other municipalities, working with our consultant to develop a proposal. We also had the initial supervisor district town halls last fall and into the winter, where we introduced our project and talked about the rationales associated with looking at parking in the county. And then we developed a proposal early this year, and we presented that to the board in 2 stages, once in March and once in June of this year. So now the red dot indicates that we are entering the next phase of engagement, and that says spring, summer, but probably will be extended into the early fall for continued engagement before we come back to or finalize a draft proposal for this project that is expected in late fall or winter of 2023 for discussion with the Planning Commission and the board. And we have some information, the project website. Tonight's presentation will be recorded for posting to the website. All of the outreach associated with these open houses will, each one will be posted for public viewing. The website also has a lot of details about the rationales for the project, white paper that has details of where we are at the various stages. We've had, there are, I believe, 3 white papers on the project website for October, March, and June to talk about, where we are heading with this project. Also has upcoming meetings for people to check into and hopefully come and attend and chat about this project, as well as other background information. And with that, I can take questions from those in the audience, or if anyone has any comments about the project or any of the aspects of the project that we've talked about tonight. And thank you very much.
Mike, you want to go back one slide? You're off of the web slide currently. There you go. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I don't, you
may need to unmute the caller because I think you're automatically muted. So they have a, I'm not sure.
All right.
So I think if you click on them, okay, there.
So we have one call in. I don't know if they have any questions or comments about tonight's presentation, or if they just were interested in listening to what we had to say. But
I do have, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi, this is Debbie Smith from the Mason District Council. You presented to us once before. And I do want to mention, I do feel this is a very important issue for residents in the county. And I know there hasn't been heavy participation. I think, the time of year that this is occurring is, it's difficult for people to sort of engage. I would encourage you all to, I don't know if if you're getting the same sense, or I don't know if this is, typical participation that you've had prior to this, but I really would encourage you all to maybe add another meeting or two in the fall when people are done with vacation. This is an extraordinarily important issue. It's going to affect quality of life for a lot of people, and I would encourage you to maybe, engage a little bit further in the fall.
Yeah, we're realizing, we realized we wanted to get this next phase started, but there is still, staff, we're still working on elements of the project. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a bit of a slower rollout, but we did want to at least get started with community engagement after the meeting. But I completely agree with you that we're going to have to come back in the fall and hopefully get more participation, because we do absolutely want more feedback on this project and where we are and what we're proposing to do. So, yes, that is anticipated.
And then just a question: that how confident are we in data we're seeing or you're using? I know we're coming out of the pandemic. I don't know when this data was derived. I don't know when your studies were done, but how confident are we in in what the current parking demand is in this sort of unique situation coming out of the pandemic? I'm noticing, at different times of day, lots more people driving. People, and then you read, different reports, different, transportation experts saying there's lower ridership on Metro, that hasn't come back. It hasn't returned to pre-pandemic levels. So there are more people on the roads doing shopping in different errands at different times, and obviously driving more and going to need parking. So question about like the timing of when your studies for parking demand had been done.
Well, we were doing studies actually before the pandemic. So looking at retail, and we were looking at restaurant demand, particularly fast food, prior to the pandemic, because we did stop once the pandemic started. We stopped doing that analysis and those surveys because clearly life was changing radically. But we do have a lot of data prior to the pandemic that's Fairfax County specific. We also, the national data that we have is also pre-pandemic data. So, you know, in a number of cases, we were trying to align the national data with what we were seeing in Fairfax County. So I think there's a strong level of confidence that the trends that we were seeing prior to the pandemic are reflected in what it is we're proposing. And we wanted to be careful about making too many assumptions during this time period from when the pandemic started going forward. So, you know, for example, as I mentioned, office parking demand is way down. But the question is that going to be a permanent feature of our lives? You know,
right,
going to be a significant amount of people that will continue to telecommute. You know, even like for example, our schedule in the county, like we are required to be in the office 2 days a week, and then the other 3 days we can telecommute. Are those types of arrangements going to continue as well? So there's a lot of kind of unanswered questions about particularly office and working environments and how, you know, how what started during the pandemic, whether that will continue. But I think the retail, even today, I think retail is more or less consistent with what was going on prior to the pandemic. So we have started doing some additional surveys of retail demand and fast food demand in the last few months, because kind of feel like, you know, that has become a little bit more stable and again, reflective of pre-pandemic conditions. So I think
sure.
I think our confidence level in what we're proposing is pretty solid based on what we were looking at prior to the pandemic.
Okay. And I do want to recognize during the pandemic, we used an awful lot of parking lots to get shots and testing and that sort of thing done. I think that's something that, you know, as an emergency measure, some things need to be taken into consideration there to have, you know, the space available. You know, God forbid we have to do something like this again, but to have those sorts of spaces available for, you know, situations that might arrive in the future that might require, you know, a mass response and lots of people utilizing outdoor space, which seemed to be, you know, very convenient to use the parking lots that were fairly empty during the pandemic.
Yeah, and that was a circumstance, you know, certainly a very unusual circumstance, but you know, whenever that happened, because of the change in, you know, schools were closed, you know, other facilities were closed. And so in that state of emergency, that area was available for these other activities related to the pandemic and treatment of patients. And that's
so making sure, I think I'm just stressing, making sure that can still remain available, you know, in the space needed, you know, in a large spaces, in different locations in different districts or something like that, but to make sure that, you know, in you know, these emergency situations, that something like that can be accommodated again in the future.
Right. And the other thing that I should point out as far as how we're looking at this approach is that, you know, 90% of the county is still going to be subject to these base rates, which still, I mean, for any particular use is going to require parking to be provided. It might not be as much as it is today as a minimum requirement, but businesses make choices about how much they want to park their sites based on their own sort of logarithms about what they feel their demand is. So, you know, just because we're lowering these rates doesn't mean that, you know, there's going to be this sort of race to the bottom as far as providing parking. I think we're still providing opportunities for businesses and developers to make a choice about parking. We're just trying to provide more flexibility in that regard for parking supply, and hopefully, you know, with right sizing of parking, that we can achieve this balance of these other goals and values that we have for the county.
Sure. Now, I don't want to dominate if you have others, I can't tell because I'm on the phone. So just let me know. I did have concerns about the environment tying green space to parking reductions. I know a lot of people are concerned about that.
Yes.
Obviously we have asphalt surfaces, and, that's not, that's, got problems with stormwater runoff and whatnot, but, finding some way to increase green space or usable park space or something for residents would be useful, obviously, to, health of the county and health of residents.
Well, I think those opportunities are available. I mean, for us, in talking about the environmental benefits of the project, there are a number of different ones that come to mind. I mean, if you are moving toward development, particularly in our high density areas of the county where you are creating more compact development with mixed uses, and it's better served by transit or even has rail, then it's a situation of, it's all, the phrase "build it and they will come" is something that's used in our realm, particularly for highway construction and things like that. But it's also kind of the opposite too. Like if you're building an environment where people have these opportunities to walk from one site to another, or they can bike easily and feel safe while biking, and they have access to rail, even car sharing, in more compact areas, more efficient from a price point of view. If these opportunities become more available, then people will be attracted to that and want to be in those areas, and it kind of de-emphasizes the influence of the automobile and de-emphasizes the need for parking. So, and that has a direct effect on the emissions, which is the number one pollutant problem in this area is vehicle emissions. So there's that element. There's the environmental element that you're referring to, which is trying to create more opportunities for green space. I think, as part of these higher percentage reduction areas, a lot of times the development occurs through a zoning process, and through the zoning process, there are other commitments that are made that are associated with providing community space, environmental, and from that point of view, if you have less need for parking, that frees up some area within the site, or frees up the ability to design those sites better to create these community spaces and create more opportunities for green with the development of the site. So, I mean, those are just two examples. There are other examples that are out there with regard to, the environmental benefits of looking at less parking.
Right. So through the zoning process, it really couldn't be incorporated into this proposal. Is how you would go about trying to secure more green space. Pardon me.
Well, we've got two different ordinances at play with this. We've got the parking project, and then we've got the ordinance, the land parking lot landscaping ordinance that is directly related to parking. And so, we're looking at both at the moment. I don't know timing wise if those will end up aligning ultimately. And then one can kind of complement the other. But at this point, we started with parking. These discussions have arisen about landscaping and open space and potential trade-offs. I mean, those opportunities exist, but it's not going to exist. It's not going to be like a one-for-one kind of situation, but we can certainly look at our parking lot landscaping ordinance to see where we can potentially enhance those requirements to dovetail with what we're doing with parking.
Yeah, this is Bill Manning with the Planning and Development. So as Mike mentioned, the board had put on one of their priority items, which is transitional screening, landscaping, parking lot landscaping. It's all mixed together. It's and the need to relook at those. So we are forming a group within the department and with our urban forestry department to kind of be the staff working on it. They're engaging a consultant now. They're just really beginning that process of doing jurisdictional research, best practices. Although we talked about earlier today, and they're hoping to bring it back to the board early next year for a decision. So for parking, our goal is end of this year, early next year. That one's a little bit further behind, but not significantly.
I see. Now, and I just want to double check if I'm intruding on anybody else who has a hand up or whatnot.
You're
I
still
do have
good.
another. Okay. So as far as the landscaping, I wasn't really familiar with that. I have just genuine concerns about parking lot design in general, not just in Fairfax County, but to me, we need safer parking lots. You get out of your car and you leave your car and immediately you enter a travel lane, a parking travel lane. And it's dangerous, women with, or families with children and strollers or toddlers in their hand. I have a disabled husband. You get out and you get out of the vehicle and you're immediately in the travel lane. I think we can do better in terms of safer transit for pedestrians through parking lots with like an island, in the center, that are flat, at a level, so that people can travel safely, pedestrians can move safely through parking lots without constantly worrying about people backing into them or that sort of thing. Is that something that the landscaping would address? Or is that hardscaping or a parking lot design?
Yeah, that would not be under the landscaping provisions. The landscaping provisions would be, currently the requirement is, 5% pre-canopy for the parking lot area. So it's not getting into the design aspects you're talking about.
Yes.
I mean, I think
What
the
would that
design
fall
aspect,
under?
well, this would probably be a major amendment to the public facilities manual to do something as your suggestion, which I understand your comment, where you're basically telling the development firms in terms of developing parking lot, it's not traditional of, create a travel aisle, and that's how you get in and out of your car, go into the store. You're creating that secondary pedestrian travel aisle, we'll say, that is shielded from it. So
like a central sidewalk, something
right.
safe. You get out of your car, you move forward, instead of go to the back of your car and enter the street. You would have some sort of travel sidewalk or something. It doesn't have to be hard, it doesn't have to be concrete, but just some sort of safe passage where you're not, you don't have people walking amongst cars that are backing up and moving through the parking lot.
Right.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, we do recognize that, particularly, when we look at zoning cases. I know firsthand that we have tried to design parking lots to be more pedestrian friendly in association with that. Clearly, that's not every circumstance, but it is something that there's an awareness of to try to address. But to Bill's point, that would probably be something that would be considered as a separate review under the auspices of our public facilities manual, which gets into design. The ordinance doesn't really discuss design, and in fact references the public facilities manual for design criteria. So
and
I figured it probably was something different from, I mean, not the parking rate. I know it's separate from that. I was just curious about the landscape, which I wasn't familiar with. So,
right. And not discounting the comment at all, but it obviously does add obviously more impervious because you're now creating that 5-foot buffer for the pedestrian between where your cars traditionally parked head to head. So that there, that's something that has to be looked at in terms of the impact of doing stuff like that. Maybe there's a trade-off because you're reducing parking, but you're adding now this additional pedestrian travel way, which I don't know I don't know if that's, you see that very often, quite frankly. I've seen it occasionally here and there, but I don't know that that's that common. Maybe you've seen it more often.
Yeah, it's with the newer developments, the newer retail developments that we've been looking at, where we've been trying to accommodate that a little bit better. Because, part of that is to try to design the retail to be more accessible, more pedestrian accessible, more pedestrian friendly, and kind of, as part of the layout, this this type of design is proposed and discussed.
Mm-hmm. And then another question I had is about surveying. Now, I like the surveys that you all do, and I was just curious: have you surveyed in some of these transit-oriented developments, residents who live there as to how many cars they own, if they feel they have sufficient parking for activities, that they might, a party or book club or events that they have? Is there sufficient guest parking? I would like to know their level of concern about adequate parking, being that they live so close to Metro.
Well, that's a good question. We haven't really don't really have that specific amount of information relative to surveying, but that's something that we should definitely look into to see if there's a way of being able to, because we've been talking about putting together a survey associated with this second stage of engagement. And so that's something we need to get back to figure out how we're going to pursue that.
Yeah, I do remember hearing, I think it was Supervisor Smith when she was on the board of supervisors. She, I think, lived close to Metro, and she said, parking is a problem. Even as close as I live to Metro Station, there is a huge parking issue. And I think currently, I heard some concern by Supervisor Palchuk about the 40% reduction in, I guess, the transit station area, or the TOD. I can't remember. She had 30 or 40% concern. But so I think that, people realize that parking at and near Metro still remains a problem. People have cars. People need to park the cars, and wonder if that's going to change. I guess we're not seeing it change that much. So I know that there have been comments about the amount being proposed. I think most recently from Supervisor Palchuk. Do you remember a comment by her recently?
Yes, during
Okay.
discussions with, I forget if it was the March discussion or the June discussion that we had with the board. She had made a comment about that, and certainly, we want to be able to continue to support the proposal, and if we can't, then clearly we'll have to rethink it. But I am expecting a parking survey for multifamily uses in Tyson's in the near future. So that will be helpful to us to be able to see, what the current demand is for parking within these multifamily buildings that are 95% occupied. So that'll be very helpful information to have as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all I can. I'm doing this on the phone. I knew the meeting was tonight, but I usually prefer to do this on the computer. But I have questions written down. But this is all I can remember now. So I appreciate the time you spent with me, and I'll relinquish the line now.
Well, and you are our special caller for tonight, because, but we do appreciate the feedback. It's very helpful, and continue to engage with us. You can engage through the project website if you have questions or comments. So I certainly
will. Yes,
we're an open book. Getting feedback.
Glad to hear it. And I do. And my first comment was about, thinking about, maybe having another meeting or two. I did push out a letter, with the meeting schedule, and, have corresponded with our group over the last several months. But it just seems like in the summertime, it's hard to get folks to engage. And I know that you don't want them to be, and they don't want to be blindsided. So
no, and frankly, we know that the summertime is has the circumstances you described, and we definitely don't want to be limiting opportunities for people to participate in the project. So clearly we're going to be continuing this into the fall, where hopefully more people will be available and willing to talk with us about the project.
Very good. Well, thank you again. I appreciate it, and for you answering all the questions I had. And
well, I'm glad you had questions, because it gave us an opportunity to elaborate on the project and be able to address your concerns, because again, this is being recorded, so this will be out there for the public to consume. So so I'm glad
Very
that
good.
we're able to come and did have a list of questions for us to ask.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you holding this event.
Not a problem.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks. And with that, we will end this presentation, and hopefully others will be able to join in the future with future presentations that we have.
Are you able to stop the recording?
I am.
Or is it? Oh.
Hold on.